Hi everyone. I got a new background for today, a new theme, which is, as you can see, it's Kyle Field. I hope it's going to be helpful. If not, then you're welcome to send me any ideas you may have for something which makes the background a little bit more fun. Quick thing before I start today's lecture, the final task video is online. I sent you the link yesterday. So again, watch the video, make sure if you have any question to send me an email, and I would recommend that you start working on that so you're not going to get everything over the last minute. Okay, so let me share my screen with you, and then we can start today's topic. Today we'll talk about terrorism financing. As usual, we will start with a quick review of Wednesday's class. So we talked about state sponsorship of terrorism, first dealing with the questions or maybe the puzzles of how does it make sense for states to sponsor terrorism despite the associated cost. And then what are the puzzling questions from the side of the terror group? Why would a terror group seek a sponsor? Then I expand a little bit more in terms of the introduction of the topic, talking about different types of sponsoring states, differentiating between them mostly on the account of their capabilities and how likely they are to oppose the terror group. And then the different modes of state sponsorship. Those include, of course, providing sanctuary, providing money, other stuff related to the organizational support or diplomatic support. And those are the different just modes of sponsorship that states can provide to terror group. And then we went over some of the theoretical approaches that we are familiar with in order to explain this decision. How does it make sense for states to support terrorism based on those different approaches? So the strategic approach talked about viewing state sponsorship as an effective method to promote goals or to project power beyond the area in which the sponsoring state is. Ideological approach talked about using non-state actors to spread belief of the sponsor. For example, I talked about the silent support that Saudi Arabia provides to ISIS. A psychological approach was mostly focusing on either the psychological traits of the leader, such as Gaddafi, or some of the psychological effects related to the group. And the structural approach was focusing on the two main structural factors: the capacity of the state. Weak states are more likely to sponsor terrorism because they also get benefits from getting outside external support from states who want to counter the terrorists, such as Pakistan was the prime example, getting the aid from the United States, military and financial aid getting from the United States, but also getting the benefit of sponsoring the terrorists from Al-Qaeda mostly, as well as regime type. Then I mentioned the two main policy options to address state sponsorship. One is using military action, that in both examples that I talked about, the Israel case with the Palestinians and the American case with Al-Qaeda, serves some kind of a blowback, and we're not clear whether this method is the more effective one, or the use of sanctions, the effectiveness of sanctions against Libya in the 1980s, and the countries which are less sensitive to those kinds of actions, such as North Korea over the years, as well as Sudan. If you have any questions regarding this topic, you are more than welcome to send them to me. The main conclusion that we can draw regarding the general discussion about state sponsorship is that both sides, the sponsoring states as well as the terror group, have to make some kind of trade-offs that decide what are they giving up for in exchange to get the benefits of this relationship. And two of the main types of sponsorship that I've mentioned was, of course, sanctuary and providing money. And today, the topic of today's lecture will focus on the latter, on financial support. So, financing of terrorism. The research is fairly limited, especially from a theoretical standpoint. Most of the research is descriptive, such as the paper that the main paper we're going to talk about today. The questions are focusing on two issues mostly. First, the question is, how do terror groups generate income from themselves? And the second question is, how do they move this money around in order to support their operations? The vast majority of financial support is raised not in the area where the terror group is located or where the attack is supposed to take place, which means the terror groups has to be able to move the money around to support their operations in order to be effective. At the same time, the fact that they have to move money around, which is something which is not a constant thing that they have to move around, represents in a way potential weak spots that states that fight terrorism can target and allegedly disrupt the terror organization in its own operations and disrupt its effectiveness. So that's another thing to think about when we're considering overall discussion about financing. So with regarding to research on terrorism financing, the main question is, there are multiple ways to transfer money around the world. Why are there some methods more likely than others, and why do groups prefer some methods over the others? So the main paper we had for today in the syllabus was the Freeman and Rosen paper, and they talked about assessing, mostly from a descriptive standpoint, the different methods to transfer funds. And they used different classification, different attributes that they looked at in order to explain the efficiency of those different methods. So let's go over them. The first one is volume. And the distinction is between electronic methods, which allow to provide transfer a large sum of money in a single transaction, compared to physical transfer, which is usually using bulk cash. And that one is more limited in terms of size and the weight. Then there's a list of risks of those different methods. So detection is the likelihood of detection. Wire transfer is much more highly to be detected, because you have to provide all this information compared to moving bulk cash across borders, which are lightly guarded, such as the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Another issue here is the anonymity of the transfer. So when we're using wire transfer with financial institutions such as banks, we have to provide private information and disclose the identity of the individuals involved, which means there's not a lot of anonymity. Compared to that, when we're using cash, there's a lot more possibility to preserve this private information. The third point is the reliability, which is wire transfer are much more accurate compared to cash, which is exposed to risk of theft or seizure by law enforcement agencies. So this is another aspect to think about. The third point, a few more points they're mentioning. So the factor of convenience is mostly dependent on the geographic or the topographic element in the area where the money is supposed to move. It's easier to move money using cash or halawas, which is another method which I'm going to talk about in a minute, in the tribal region around Afghanistan and Pakistan, for example. In terms of how simple it is to implement the different method to transfer funds, so terror groups favor the most simple method, which requires the fewest steps and the lowest form of technology, which makes it easiest. It doesn't require any specific skill, which means they're less likely to employ a complicated money laundering schemes with multiple steps and multiple actors involved. It's much easier to conduct multiple wire transfers, small wire transfers of money to a terror group than trying to implement a more complicated black market peso exchange, as an example for another method to move money. Any type of money transfer has transaction costs. So official financial services such as banks and other services charge a fee that ranges between 1% to 10% on the amounts. Halawas, which I'm going to talk in a few minutes exactly what it is, another method that's very, very common. They charge much less, about 0.2 to 0.5% of that transaction, which makes it cheaper, of course. Moving bulk money, bulk cash across borders usually requires to allocate some of those monies to provide side payments to border guards or to bribe custom officials. So again, this is part of the cost of moving money around using this kind of method. And the last one is the speed, which is a very critical factor because terrorists want to ensure the quickest method that the money is going to move to where it is to go, where it needs to get to in order to support operations. So hawalas, which again, I promised for the third time over the last 8 minutes, I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, is much faster than using official banking. Moving bulk cash across border depends on the distance you have to go through, the number of border crossings you need to clear. So again, the factors we have on the way depends on how fast the money can go. And that's another thing which have to be taken under consideration. The next part of the introduction is to talk about the different methods of moving around money, of financing terrorism. So there are several methods to transfer money, and I want to go over them, starting from the most simple method to the most complex method. So moving cash using couriers is the simplest and oldest way to transfer money. The money is usually just concealed within the packaging of the individuals who cross the borders. One of the main limitations for that, again, as I just mentioned in the previous slide, is the speed. It's usually slower due to the distance that has to be crossed. There's also a risk of operational security, whether you can actually trust the people who are moving the money. A couple of historical examples. So Al-Qaeda used couriers before 9/11 a lot. Over $1 million were moved from couriers from Pakistan into Afghanistan. This money actually was brought into Pakistan with different, similar variation of couriers from the Gulf countries. And after the money was in Afghanistan, a substantial amount of it that we used for the attack, for the 9/11 attacks, was transferred by cash, by couriers, or the perpetrators of the attacks themselves when they enter the US and just deposit the cash money in American banks. So we can look at this is just as one example that they have in the paper. And if you look at the top picture and where it leads to, so you have on the right-hand side here, this is the perpetrators, the attackers in 9/11. And this is some of the important individuals that were important for the funding of the operation. So Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, one of the leaders of 9/11, according to this specific illustration, provided $10,000 in cash to each one of the hijackers, which they brought with them into the United States, deposited in the local banks, and were able to use the money to fund the operation. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Iraq, has relied on cash couriers for about 70% of its budget, money coming from Europe or volunteers from Saudi Arabia. And Jama'ah Islamiyah, which is a terror group in Indonesia, in East Asia, has financed their attacks in Bali, which were in the early 2000s, again, using this same method. So that's that's the simple type of method. The next one is the informal transfer system, which was called, as I mentioned a few times, this word, and I will talk exactly what it is. It's the halawas. So there are several types. These are money transfer networks. They're based on the traditional roots of the individuals that are involved in the transactions and their ethnic ties. They're very prevalent in areas where there's less formal banking, or if there's a large diaspora living in that area. And how does that exactly works? Now, the way it works is that when two sides need to complete the deal, the money is given to a local dealer. I'll just use this map here as an example. This is an attack, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute. So now we're talking about the need to move money from Pakistan, which is here on the right-hand side of the picture, to an individual here in the US. So the money in Pakistan is given to a local dealer. This dealer is contacting another dealer in the target location, in this case, the United States. And then the customer, in this case, this was this individual, comes to the dealer in the United States. He has to provide that dealer with a very specific code. If he gives him the right code, then he will get the money from the dealer in the United States. And that's how the money is actually transferred. Then the dealer, the American dealer and the dealer in Pakistan, are selling the accounts themselves by other transactions or any other movement method. To give you some sense of this system, it has a global net size of about $500 billion. And in most cases, this is a legal method. Since 9/11, the degree of scrutiny over this method has significantly increased because it's played a very substantial role in financing the operations of Al-Qaeda and Taliban here. And this is what you have here on the slides now. This is the attempted attack in Times Square in 2010. So as you can see, the money was transferred to two different dealers from Pakistan to the United States with two different dealers, and then to the customer. And then that's a substantial amount of money that was used to fund that specific attack. It's important to understand that the dealers, what's called the hawaladars, do not necessarily know the purpose of the money that they deliver. They just serve as an endpoint in a common business transaction. So that's just moving money around. It's very common in the Arab world, also in Asia, to use this method. And terror groups have used that to their advantage. So the main benefits for using the hawalas is, first is the speed. It's completed within really 1 or 2 days in this case. It's anonymous. There's no record of the transaction. And one of the main benefits that you don't have to actually move money across the border, because you use money from the local banks that you have. Each dealer uses money in its own area. The transaction fees and exchange rates are usually much lower than other methods, and it's also very convenient because it's used in areas where official banking methods are less common. So once the relationship between the dealers is established, it's much easier to implement that. So that's another method. Moving up the ladder of complexity, the next is what's called money services businesses, MSB. These are institutions that are subjected to the same laws as banks. An example for that is Western Union. Western Union is a money service business. In most cases, those institutions are less rigid when it comes to some of the identification details. So they require ID for the individuals that has to transfer the money. They do not require to have an account, for example. So that's one way where it's a little bit easier than using banks, but not as much. Some of the famous attacks in February 2013, American authorities arrested 4 Somali immigrants in the area of Minnesota, as they tried to use this kind of method to fund attacks by Al-Shabaab. Those 4 individuals attempted to conceal the transfer of money of supporting terrorism within the overall traffic of legitimate remittances that use those kinds of services. Sorry, this was the wrong button. Before 9/11, Al-Qaeda has extensively used this method. One of the famous cases, which is a much more complicated attempt to support terrorism, is the famous Hezbollah money laundering case when using the money service institutions in Beirut. So in this case, what happened was that it was part of an extended money laundering operation using a drug trafficking network, and it spanned across multiple countries and multiple continents. Money from drug trafficking in the US was actually laundered through a car dealership from the US and into Africa. From there, the cash was moved to a bank and the money service institution in Beirut, along with other cash that needs to support the drug ring. And those specific MSBs, the money service institute, the money service banks, were directly connected to Hezbollah. After this specific complicated money laundering scheme was detected, it made it much harder to use those money service businesses, since there was more attention by law enforcement agencies to those institutions. In terms of their benefits, so they're very fast. It takes usually a couple of minutes to complete the transaction. If you ever used Western Unions in the past, you know that. The fees are not that high relatively, and the detection is very, very low. There's very low risk of detection. That's another benefit in this case. The next method is using formal bankings. Those are heavily regulated in most developed countries. They require to identify customers, and they report any kind of suspicious activities of money transfers. In areas which are outside of the Western context, such as the example I just talked about with Hezbollah, then there is relatively less regulation and less monitoring of even banks in this case, especially bank employees, which provide some opening for terror groups maybe to take advantage of that when they're trying to finance their operations. However, there are also cases where despite following all the regulations and the rules, money transfer for terrorists using banks can actually get lost in the crowd. And this is exactly where the 9/11 case comes into play. The money that was transferred to hijackers was not alarming, mostly because they use small size amounts that some argue that even today, when there's a lot more monitoring on transferring money over worldwide, it's not likely to raise a red flag. So eventually those transactions, was a lot of small transactions, got lost in the crowd and were not detected. There's other banking options which offer opportunities to use legal financing using the banking system. One example is what's called the correspondent accounts. Correspondent accounts are accounts that are set up in local areas, in offshore locations. They are linked to American banks and allowed to do transactions of large amounts using dollars, American dollars. In the vast majority of cases, when those kind of accounts are open, the American banks conduct thorough examination of these offshore locations. But one of the famous cases where those procedures were not followed was the HSBC bank in Saudi Arabia in 2005. The procedures were not followed. The Saudi bank was able to use this method to finance a lot of terror groups. So even when you use formal banking, there are possibilities and there are openings for terror groups to take advantage of that and move the money around to support their operations. False trade invoices is a complex laundering method. It's very difficult to detect, which makes it one of the favorites among terror groups as well as criminals. It's very time consuming, especially to set up. The idea behind this method is that within trading, what the traders are doing, that they're over invoicing of their products, and that allows us to conceal money transfers between those two locations. So for example, if you want to transfer, if you want to trade two commodities between two areas, the local traders are charging a higher fee for export of a legitimate product, and the excess funds is intended to go to the terror group. This method was also used before 9/11 for using money using shipments of honey, which again is a legitimate product to Yemen. So that's one way that they used legitimate product, export of legitimate products in order to transfer money. A study by the Commerce Department of the American government, of data by the Commerce Department, has helped identify some businesses who use this method to finance terrorism some point after 2001. Then, and one of the methods that was used in order to fight this specific method was the establishment of the TTUs, which are Trade Transparency Units, which increasing the port security, analyzing a lot of big data sources, and mostly focusing on trying to identify those specific suspicious transactions. The problem or the downside of this specific branch of the government is that they're not likely to prevent this kind of funding operation while it takes place. They're more likely to discover it later when the investigation takes place. The main benefits of this methods, at one hand, it is complicated to set up. It's very time consuming to set up, but it is very convenient if the parties involved in the transaction have the business in place, which makes detection very, very unlikely. Finally, the last method is what's called trading in high value commodities. That's the use of gold and diamond in order to transfer funds. Both of those commodities are easy to transfer. They're easy to convert into cash. The negative side in this case, it must be transferred by hand, so there's a risk of theft and seizure in this case. Specifically for gold, it has the advantage of it can be reshaped to different forms, so it's easier to move it, so there's lower risk of detection. It also has very important cultural value in the Middle East as well as South Asia, which makes the trade of gold, moving gold as a way to finance terror operations, less suspicious, because it's very prevalent in those areas that gold is being traded. Okay, so after introducing the different method of financing terrorism, what I want to do for the rest of the talk that I have is to discuss various issues related to the funding of terrorism. So first, in recent years, there are more and more efforts to increase the amount of scrutiny and the share of information between financial institutions in order to prevent these kinds of illegal money operation take place, also for illegal transfer of money. And that's exactly the point. In the vast majority of cases, and the money transfers to terror groups are just part of the overall legitimate traffic of global funds. So it's very hard to detect when a specific transaction is intended to fund terrorism compared to just a regular global transaction of money. Think about the funding of the 9/11 hijackers and how it is to identify these patterns within the overall global transfers of money, just as an example. If we want to further tackle these issues and go deeper into identify them, that means we have to address and talk and go back to questions regarding civil liberties. So the question in this case, how much are we as citizens of this country are willing to sacrifice our ability to conduct the very basic financial businesses in order to prevent terrorism? Are we willing to have even more scrutiny on the way that we do business and we get our money moved around in order to prevent terrorism? That's a question that's related to civil liberties. I want to introduce another method of financing, which is very prevalent in South Asia and the Middle East, and that's the use of charities. This method is prevalent for financing of local organizations that fund their activities using local donations. There are transnational or regional groups that has the ability to draw funds from larger charities, so also fund themselves that way. Transnational groups which has some kind of a common feature across areas, such as in this case Islamic terrorists, they have the feature of Islam, can benefit from the vast array of charities that are existing in the Islamic world, in the Arab countries, in order to, again, generate more income to the terror group. In terms of the foundation of charity, so this is based on, in the Islamic standpoint, on what's called a zakat, which is a cultural, social tradition in Islam for providing support to those in need. Because the vast majority of the money given to charities, just like as there is also here in the United States, in this case in other places in the world, is intended to provide support for or supporting social services and education for those in need. But terror organizations, which by themselves sometimes provide social services, use these kinds of funds also to finance their operations. In terms of examples, so these are important sources of money for some groups. For example, the Jamaah Islamiyah in Southeast Asia have used this kind of method as part of their financing the attacks in Bali in early 2000, Bali in Indonesia. And also, charities established by Al-Qaeda members in East Asia were instrumental in funding the attempted attacks against several international airlines in 1995. So this method is very, very important and is used. Before I'm going into the last part of the discussion today, I want to stop for today's attendance word. So for today, the attendance word is Daniel, which is, by the way, the name of one of my kids. So attendance word for today is Daniel. Send it to me after you watch the video. All right, the last part is based on actually some questions that I had in class before we were required to and not meeting class anymore, unfortunately, because of the situation at the moment, was about the relationship between terror groups and criminal organizations. And that's what I want to finish with today. So one way for terror groups to generate income is to cooperate with, to engage in criminal activities, cooperate with criminal organizations in order to get money. The main incentives for them is that closer ties with criminals allows them to generate a more stable stream of funds to support their operations, which is a much more stable income compared to donations or charities that were really on one-time transactions with the other methods that I mentioned earlier, which are much harder in terms of providing a long-term solution of financing the group. The main benefit for terror group in this case is provide them access to multiple illegal sources of finances, such as the black market or illegal trafficking. And those are important funds that, again, they're operating constantly and allow them to fund their attacks and fund the operation of the groups constantly. Now, because there's a cooperation here also with the criminal organization, they also have their own benefits from this cooperation. So the criminal organization has two benefits from cooperating with terror groups. First is that they are securing access to military capabilities, which allows to secure their own legal actions. So, for example, by cooperating with terror group, they can secure their smuggling of drugs operations, which provide funds for them, or any kind of other high value commodities. And second, from a more general standpoint, when they provide funds to terror organizations, there are more terror attacks, which further destabilizes the structure of the country in which they operate, keeps security forces occupied with terrorism and not with organized crime. And it makes criminal activities much easier and more profitable. So again, they have their own benefits to why to cooperate with terror organizations and provide them also financial support. So as I said, there's not a lot of deep studies that go deep in theory to these questions related to terrorism financing, but within this, what's called the terrorism crime nexus, there are a few recent studies, and I want to talk about one of them, and that's the Jadoun and Milton paper from last year. They're focusing on what's called shadow economies as the parameters for funding used by non-state actors, in this case related to terror organizations and criminal organizations. So shadow economies are defined as the state's informal economy, the part of the economy which includes all activities that are not part of the official government regulation and taxation. That can include illegal activities such as trafficking of drugs or trafficking of other commodities, or illegal activities and tax evasion from those legal activities. All this together comprises what's called the shadow economies. They argue that both types of actors, so both terror and criminal organizations, operate within conditions which further provide incentives for cooperation whenever they operate within those kinds of economies. And their study shows that the greater the size of this shadow economy, the terror attacks are more lethal, because again, there's more money moving around to criminal organizations which have the incentives to cooperate with the terror groups, provide them the money, and the terror groups in turn can just operate and execute their attacks. So for the criminal organization, again, the benefits from the relations based on their study is their ability to increase their capacity to consolidate their power within the area in which they operate, these economies. The terror groups is, just as I said, is able to secure a steady growing source of funding for the long run. So again, the benefits for both sides are evident in this specific case. We're talking about the structural idea of shadow economies, which leads me to the next slide. If we're looking at this this concept of shadow economies from a structural perspective, so this cooperation is likely in countries which have very weak capacity. And the question in this case is why? And the answer is that weak states are more likely to have larger informal shadow economies. That means there's a larger portion of their overall economic environment is informal, which again allows more support for the criminal organization, which means more support in this case for the terror group and more terrorism. A couple of examples in this case: in 1993, the terror organization's ELN in Colombia was hired by local criminal drug organizations in order to attack their rival using car bombs. So again, this aspect of using military tactics as part of the drug wars and which incentivizes more cooperation between terror group and criminal organizations. In 1994, the Taliban was able to gain, since 1994 actually, the Taliban was able to gain a lot of support by providing security to smugglers and traders along the Pakistan and Afghanistan border. So again, these cooperations provide benefits for both sides. The last point that I want to mention is the risk that involves for that, and we're going to focus mostly on the risk for the terror organization because that's what we care about most, is the argument that cooperation with criminal organizations is leading to criticism on the terror group for subjecting their ideological or sometimes political objectives or missions for working with those kinds of low-level criminals. That's how many can view that. And this kind of argument is more prevalent when we're talking about pure ideologists of the terror group. And while it may be deterrent on some level, the vast majority of empirical evidence shows that the benefits from this cooperation between criminals and terrorists is largely outweighs the potential risks or costs. There's some support for the cooperation based on the fact that it prolongs the group's likelihood of survival, again, the terror groups. Also, the cooperation with criminals provide the terror group with the resources that they can then distribute to their supporters and in a way deflect this kind of ideological criticism. And the example, again, here comes back to the Taliban. Their profits from trafficking in the Afghan border allows them to provide goods to the local population and deflect any kind of ideological concern that this population may have had. Okay, so that's this topic. As I said, there's a very limited amount of research on the topic of terrorism financing, of terrorism funding, mostly from a theoretical standpoint. And there's a lot of research just coming out. As you can see, some of those papers that I provided as an additional studies are just over the last couple of years. And a lot of them, again, focusing also on the relationship with the criminal organizations. That is it for today. Stay safe. Have a great weekend. And I will see you next week. Bye, everyone.